Hi everybody, Professor Kauser here, doing another video lecture for the 6th century class. Probably not too long of a one this time, just wanted to hit a few things. We are at the point of winding up on Byzantine religion, which hopefully we'll be finishing up with Monday's discussion, and getting into the secret history, which I hope we'll be able to have done with by Wednesday. There's not a lot really to lecture on by way of setting up the secret history, but I did want to talk a little bit about thinking about Procopius as a writer and having some awareness of the Roman literary tradition which he's coming out of. I think you'll find it's pretty clear that Procopius is a fairly aristocratic individual. He seems to really identify with sort of Roman tradition. He doesn't like innovation. He doesn't like change. So he's rather conservative that way. And also that he's quite educated, right? He's highly literary, has quite a bit of background. He'll make references in the secret history and allusions, that's with an A-L, not illusions, but allusions, references to all sorts of things from past Roman literature and past Roman history, sort of showing off his knowledge of it. And I just wanted you to think about that as you're reading the secret history and be somewhat aware of it in terms of how the Roman educational system worked that Procopius is coming out of and how that might be clues in some ways to part of what he's doing. In Rome, education, you went through a number of stages, starting with learning from a grammarian who would teach you your letters and teach you how to sound out words and how to do basic sort of literacy kinds of skills. And then you moved on to a teacher who would sort of advance you in that, and then finally to a rhetorician, the rhetor, R-H-E-T-O-R, the rhetor who was your sort of advanced teacher. It was a very linguistically oriented education. Hopefully, if you had a good school or a good teacher, you might also get some mathematics and some science and things like that, but it was really mostly focused on training young men how to read and particularly how to write, and most of all, how to give speeches, right? A very oral kind of tradition. This was a literary culture in which writing was mostly used as an aid to speech. Roman books very often did not have spaces between words and also did not have very much punctuation because you were supposed to scan it and read it out loud, and you could tell the way that Roman sentences were structured where the sentence ended. You didn't need a period to tell you it was the end of a sentence. People normally read out loud. In the 4th century, the Christian teacher Augustine wrote about his amazement when he met Ambrose, the Bishop of Milan in Italy, and encountered him reading in the garden and was shocked that Ambrose was reading a book without even moving his lips. Wasn't speaking out loud. It was reading completely silently without moving his lips at all. That was a rather remarkable degree of achievement in literacy as far as Augustine was concerned, because most people weren't capable of doing that. You normally spoke out loud and used the text to sort of prompt you in what you would say. So it's very oral, right? Very face-to-face spoken kind of a culture in that way. So learning how to compose speeches was really the absolute key element. And these were used in a lot of important ways. If you were in the military, commanders were expected to give speeches to inspire their soldiers before battle and explain to them why they were fighting and why it was important that they win, and urge them onwards to major deeds. Of course, people were frequently giving speeches at the law courts, trying to advocate their cases or defend themselves against charges going on there. Emperors would have to address their subjects. People would have to make speeches before the court of the emperor in a diplomatic context or to make a petition, things like that. So the art of public speech making was absolutely very essential. And you see it coming up really a lot in Roman writing in many forms. If you read, for example, a lot of books in the Roman historical tradition, historical writing, to a great degree it is, say, Livy or Suetonius or one of these. To a great extent you get, well, not so much Suetonius, but Tacitus, you get a series of speeches kind of with fill-in description of the action in between. Sort of, but here's one great speech, and then here's a number of actions that'll lead you up to the next great speech, and then a series of actions or battles or something that'll lead you up to the next great speech. And it's really about sort of stringing the speeches together from one to the other. Not that all writing necessarily was speeches that way, and you're not going to see people making many speeches in the secret history, but it's important. That's a background to how Procopius was trained. It's a very rhetorical form. Going along with that, there's also a blend of styles that writers learned how to use. You could use what was called the low style, which was mostly meant for sort of conveying factual information. That would be the way that people like you and I normally talk on the street on an ordinary basis, just not very ornamented, not very fancy, just straightforward, short sentences giving information. But people generally would not think very highly of you if you got up in public to make a speech and only use the low style. Then be considered terribly, terribly dull, and why did we bother listening to you if you're not going to give us any more than that? At the opposite extreme, you have the high style of speech, which could be extremely florid, extremely roundabout, would sound very pretentious to modern ears. All sorts of sort of poetic language and metaphors and imagery and references to famous literary passages from Homer or from Virgil or from Cicero, things like that. Lots of imagery and metaphors and all this kind of thing, lots of literary devices in order to really gussy it up and sort of put on the verbal fireworks. Kind of difficult for a modern reader to penetrate in some ways because it's just so thick with sort of getting across the sort of spectacular verbal gymnastics, and you have to sort of dig through it to find, where's the substance in there. And then there was the middle style, which of course was elevated, but not quite as elevated as the high style. If you think about things like in American history, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 7 years ago, our forefathers brought forth upon this continent nation. That would be what a Roman would consider middle style, right? It's not totally overblown, flowery rhetoric, but it's not quite just, the way that people speak on a day-to-day basis either. It wasn't even in Lincoln's time. It's a bit elevated, a bit more force to it, a bit more show to it, but not full out, firing all the cannons the way that the high style would do. So there's all these different modes that people could go in, and they could shift back and forth between them depending on what they're trying to do. When a student was learning their rhetorical skill, normally the way that they would do it is they would be given examples from the classics to imitate. It was a very conservative kind of education. To some degree, when you are reading the writings of the Roman Empire's literati, it's a little bit like when you're dealing with Monty Python fans, right? Where they've all seen the same movies and they've all seen the same episodes, and all they need to do is quote one line, and everybody immediately knows the whole scene that they're referring to, right? All the other Monty Python fans do it. Very quickly catches on so that everybody instantly recognizes what the whole scene is about. Roman education was kind of the same way. There was a very finite body of classics. In the course of their education, everybody read the same few dozen or couple hundred books, all knew them inside and out because they had studied them line by line under their teachers, and therefore everybody could pull out a line from one or a famous phrase or a famous image, and people would instantly get the reference, and people would instantly know the whole background that they were referring to, and that's really sort of key. Can make it a little bit tricky for modern readers, again, because a lot will tend to go over our heads. Or there may be things that seem perfectly straightforward for us to understand the bare words, but you don't understand the full implications unless you also recognize that they might be riffing on or quoting something from a past writer, and it's tended to evoke a whole scene back there. So that's a key element. But anyway, as you were composing your speeches, you would draw on the models of the great speech makers of the past, or the great poets of the past, or the great whatever, and you would use those as the models for your own speech. Okay, so for example, Cicero, if you were writing in Latin, would be a very popular one to draw on. Demosthenes, if you were writing in Greek, sort of the great rhetoricians of what were already ancient times by the time we're looking at Procopius, living hundreds of years earlier. Those would have been key figures that you would have imitated. You'd be given an assignment from your professor or your teacher saying, okay, suppose you're in a law court and your client has been accused of murder or theft or something. Write the speech, write the defense speech. How would you go about defending this kind of a person against this kind of a charge? Or you might be given a sort of historical situation. Say, you are Julius Caesar, and you've marched your army down to Rome, and you're about to have yourself declared dictator, or you want the Senate to declare you dictator for life. Okay, what's the speech you give them in order to justify why they ought to vote you into this powerful title? So set up the situation, and then construct your own speech, and you go back and you look at the actual ones, and then you model yours on those. Wasn't an education that was really designed to promote individuality or creativity or anything like that, although of course, great writers were creative, but was more intended to sort of train you into the tradition, teach you the rules, the way that they had developed over time of how to construct these kinds of texts. So that's very much in the background of what Procopius is doing. Now, in what he's actually doing, there are a number of things going on that he's drawing on. One is that there is a Roman biographical tradition. um, You can see it in the Greek writer, Roman era Greek writer Plutarch, writing his Parallel Lives, in which he would recount the careers of eminent Greeks and eminent Romans and put them in comparison to kind of judge, who was the better or who was the worse, or how did they match up to each other, the Roman and the Greek, kind of setting the two cultures side by side. In the case of particularly doing biographies of emperors, you have the background of Suetonius, who would write biographies of the 12 first Caesars, the Julio-Claudian emperors, and would describe their various doings, frequently with a lot of sort of gossip from the court and that kind of thing, or at least the sort of traditions that had grown up around those early emperors and all the alleged goings-on that had happened in their court. Tacitus does something similar back around the 1st century. Suetonius and Tacitus are both writing around the year 100 AD, so several hundred years also before Procopius, and would have been well known to Procopius. Excuse me. So that's one thing to bear in mind, is you have this biographical tradition of writing the life of an emperor. Procopius is in a bit of a different situation than most of them are, than someone like Suetonius is, because Suetonius was writing about emperors who were already dead by the time he was writing. He's writing around 100 AD, but he's going back to write about Augustus, about Tiberius, about Claudius, and Caligula, Nero, and Caligula, then Claudius, then Nero, and so forth, the other earlier Caesars. So he's really writing in kind of a historical vein about deceased emperors for a current audience in 100 AD, sort of thinking about what it means to be Roman, what it means to have the Roman Empire, and what direction the empire ought to be going in the future. Another tradition that he has to draw on is the tradition represented by writers like Juvenal and a couple of others, which is a satirical tradition. This was normally more, at least in Juvenal's case, more in the form of poetry. Ovid also wrote in this vein when he wrote The Art of Love. You do have this tradition of sort of scandal mongering, of satirizing people, lampooning them, spreading all sorts of scurrilous rumors about them. With the aim of a kind of a social criticism, perhaps intended to be, there's really usually in the satire, it's intended to be humorous, it's intended to make the subjects of the satire look ridiculous and look despicable, but that also carries an implication that there's a moral undertone as well, right? When the satirist, talks about somebody's affairs or their various foolish things they've gotten into, then they're not doing it just so that people will laugh, but they're also doing it to make an example out of them, to, sort of make them look contemptible, and thereby urge people to do the opposite and live the opposite, and of course also to undermine the power or the authority of these people. Juvenal in particular, when we take a look at the treatment of Theodora in The Secret History, Juvenal, 500 years earlier, had written a satire on a woman named Messalina, who was attached to the Caesar's household and to some prominent senatorial families, and had made very much the same kind of scurrilous, sexual, virtually pornographic kind of claims about Messalina's private life and things that had gone on there. And you can see a lot of echoing of that in Procopius's construction of the alleged character of Theodora there. So you want to be aware when he's doing these things, you want to ask sort of, does he have a source of information on this? Does he indicate what his sources of information are? Is he reporting what he's hearing, or is he drawing on a tradition in order to cast Theodora or to cast Justinian in the mold of a particular person from the past? So that's also a very important factor. Excuse me. Let's see, just trying to think if there's any other references I wanted to make there. I guess the key thing then when you think about it is, think about The Secret History not only as a report on what is going on or what is allegedly going on in Byzantium at the time, but also be aware of it as a work of literary construction. Watch for structure of the book, how is it organized, watch for juxtaposition, what sort of episodes does he put next to each other, what kinds of things kind of get separated and detached off from each other? How does he try to group things in order to make it look like there's a particular message going on? What is the intended impact on an audience of reading this sort of account? And then finally, there's also one other thing. Ask, what is Procopius's agenda? Obviously, he doesn't like Justinian and Theodora. That'll be quite clear. But who is the intended audience, and what do you think Procopius intends them to do about it? When he makes these kinds of literary allusions, it sort of works in a number of ways. One is that it will establish Procopius's own bona fides, right? It establishes that he is an educated literary person. He belongs to this exclusive elite kind of a group, and that establishes a certain credibility or authority for him, even if he's satirizing, even if it's clear that some of the things are not meant literally. But you want to think about that. It also has another effect in that it tends to depict the people he's writing about in a cast of characters that are well known from ancient literature and ancient history, right? That people would recognize them as, okay, they're this type of character, they're that type of characters. You know, a modern version of so-and-so, and you want to ask who those models are and how the viewers might be responding to them. Okay, so be aware of the literary tradition. We'll talk about it more when we get together on Monday. This is obviously not a full hour of lecture, so you got a bit of extra time to devote to the reading. Oh, and let's see, that reminds me one other thing. For the second batch, everybody is supposed to be reading part 1 of the text. The whole text will probably be an awful lot for you to read. I encourage you to make an effort to read the whole thing. But if your last name ends with begins, if your last name begins with the letters A through L, then make sure you read part 2 and have part 3 be secondary if you have time to get around to it. That'd be great. If your last name ends with M through Z, begins with M through Z, sorry, your last name begins with M through Z, then focus on part 3, and you can just skim part 2 or just glance at part 2 briefly to get a sense of it. And that way everybody will be able to share with each other a little more detail about what kinds of things are going on in the text. Great. Thank you, everybody. Bye.